Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're decoding Dr. John Oswalt's breakdown of Isaiah chapters 4 and 5. We're going to explore this wild, ancient tension between divine hope and devastating judgment. We've got some incredibly powerful imagery to unpack, looking at how the prophet Isaiah communicated a message that is, honestly, as jarring as it is beautiful. Let's get right into it. Think about this for a second. Why would a perfectly tended vineyard yield only a bitter harvest? Imagine putting years of back-breaking labor into a plot of land, doing literally everything right, only to be rewarded with something entirely unpalatable. This emotional, shocking scenario is exactly how God confronts his people through Isaiah. But to figure out how he actually gets that bitter harvest, we first need to see how Isaiah builds his case. Section 1. The Pendulum of Prophecy. To really grasp this, we need to look at the architectural blueprint of these chapters. Isaiah uses this powerful literary device called interchange. It's basically like a pendulum. He violently swings his audience between the corrupted Israel that currently exists and the glorious Israel that is promised. It's this constant, rhythmic oscillation, A to B, A to B. It totally forces the listener to confront the massive gap between their current reality and their divine potential. Section 2. The Branch of Hope. All right, let's start with the A side of the pendulum, this beautiful vision of radiant hope. There's a really fascinating debate over the phrase, the branch of the Lord. When Isaiah says the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, is he talking directly about the coming Messiah? Or, based on Hebrew poetry's structure of parallelism, where the second half of the sentence mirrors the first, is he actually making a promise of a literally fruitful land bursting with life to contrast the desert they're currently living in? Well, reputable scholars sit on both sides of this. But either way, the core promise, it's one of incredible, abundant life. So whether it's the Messiah or the literal fruitfulness of the land, the absolute core promise for the survivors in Zion is that they will be called holy. And let's pause here, because holy doesn't just mean a religious title or simply being set apart. In a pagan world, a cruel or unclean god could be called holy just for being otherworldly. But in the biblical covenant, holiness implies a total transformation into the righteous character of God himself. It's not just a position on a chessboard, it's a radically transformed condition. Section 3. Cleansed by the fire. But actually getting to that holy condition? That requires going through a pretty painful purification. God promises to wash away the filth with a spirit, or ruach, of judgment and fire. Since biblical Hebrew has a relatively small vocabulary, ruach can mean wind, breath, or spirit, entirely depending on the context. Here, it paints this vivid picture of a massive firestorm sweeping through the land. For these people, hope isn't about dodging judgment, it's about being cleansed by it. The judgment is literally the vehicle of their salvation. This brilliantly illustrates how the prophets viewed Israel's history. It's not a simple circle, it's a vicious, downward spiraling helix. Think back to the book of Judges. The people are blessed, they immediately forget God and worship idols, God lets enemies oppress them, they cry out in pain, and God sends a deliverer to restore order. But they don't just magically go back to where they started. With each cycle, the moral baseline drops. It's a tightening downward helix. Isaiah sees the coming exile as part of this exact pattern, but he also sees a new opportunity for a fresh start waiting on the other side. So once the fire has burned away all that corruption, God promises a new exodus. Isaiah uses some striking imagery here, a protective canopy of cloud by day and flaming fire by night right over Mount Zion. It's an undeniable throwback to God shielding the Israelites in the desert. But the real key takeaway from this sequence is that the cleansing must happen before the shelter is provided. You can't expect the protective canopy of God if you're actively living in rebellion to his moral order, right? Section 4. Song of the Vineyard. Just as we're feeling the warmth of that divine canopy, Isaiah executes a hard pivot. He swings that pendulum right back to the bitter reality of chapter 5. He taps into the deep pathos and passion of God, singing a love song to an audience of Judean farmers. You have to remember, Judah is essentially a giant rock pile uniquely suited for growing exactly one thing, grapes. So when Isaiah sings about a vineyard, the ears of every single farmer in that crowd would immediately perk up. They know exactly what it takes to cultivate that difficult land. He describes the meticulous, back-breaking care the beloved took. Imagine this, for an entire year, just clearing rocks to build walls. The second year, planting the absolute best vines available, building a watchtower, carving a heavy stone winepress completely out of solid rock.
This is a 3-year investment of pure sweat and love. And then, finally, the harvest arrives. The beloved tastes that first bursting grape, only to discover it is completely heartbreakingly bitter. And not just one grape, all of them.
Here's the crucial point. It's a brilliant rhetorical trap. Isaiah asks the audience, what should the beloved do? And you can just imagine those farmers, totally outraged at the wasted labor, shouting out, tear it up, let the wild animals devour it. And right when he has them angrily agreeing to the destruction of the vineyard, Isaiah points the bony prophetic finger and declares, you are the vineyard. Bam. The judgment they just pronounced was actually on themselves.
Section 5. Harvesting the better grapes.
Let's unspool exactly what made those grapes so incredibly bitter. Isaiah uses a devastating auditory wordplay here in the original Hebrew. God looked for mishpat, which is justice, but instead he found mishpach, which means bloodshed. He expected tzedakah, righteousness, but instead he heard zaka, the scream of the oppressed. It's absolutely brilliant poetry, but a complete moral tragedy. The harvest wasn't just underwhelming, it was the exact horrifying opposite of what the Creator cultivated them for. Isaiah lists these bitter fruits as 6 woes. Now, in Hebrew, this isn't some angry, vindictive threat. It's a word of profound regret and grief. It's more like a tearful alas. Isaiah is weeping over a society that is spiraling downward. It starts with simple greed, moves into self-indulgence, descends into openly mocking God, and ultimately leads to the complete inversion of the moral order, literally calling evil good and good evil. It bottoms out with corrupt leaders whose only real skill is mixing strong drinks, and who happily acquit the guilty for a bribe.
Section 6. The looming darkness.
Because the moral order has been totally upended, we arrive at the terrifying, inevitable therefore. Because they despise the Torah, the instruction of the Holy One, the protective hedge is officially removed. Isaiah paints a vivid picture of desolation here. The massive estates built on the backs of the oppressed will be laid to ruin, and nomads' sheep will peacefully graze right in the living rooms of the formerly rich. It's a total, devastating humbling of human pride. And this humbling paves the way for the terrifying arrival of the Assyrian army. God doesn't just passively let the walls crumble. He actively summons them. He whistles for them, calling them like wild lions to devour the vineyard. Isaiah describes them as this monster machine advancing with frightening efficiency. None are weary, none stumble or sleep. Their arrows are sharp, their horses' hooves are like flint, and their chariot wheels are like a whirlwind. They are an unstoppable force, and no one can rescue the prey from their teeth.
We're going to leave you with this final chilling thought from Isaiah, drawn right from the end of chapter 5. God is light. But if you deliberately reverse the moral order, if you call good evil and evil good, and cut yourself off from the Creator, you are cutting yourself off from the very source of light itself. If you insist on being the source of your own light, who are you going to call when the Assyrian machine is at your door? Are you prepared for the total, suffocating darkness and distress that inevitably follows? It's a profound warning that echoes just as loudly today as it did to those Judean farmers centuries ago.